Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. We're really excited today to be talking with Dr. Lisa Miller. And Lisa, I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself. But first off, thanks so much for coming on and talking with us.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm a professor of political science at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. I study American politics, public law, and I've done a lot of work on the politics of crime and punishment. And I'm working on a new book called The Myth of Checks and Balances and the American Democratic Deficit.
Awesome. I'm excited to talk about that topic. How did you become interested in American political structures, but particularly the Constitution?
Yeah. Well, I've always been interested in how ordinary people, people without access to power and money, and particularly marginalized groups, low-income people, um, how they try to access government, how they try to influence policy and processes and the sort of rules that govern society. And I started in the 1990s actually studying crime and policing at the very local level. And I learned over the course of that research that there's a very complicated American political structure, local politics, state politics, federal government, different branches of government that all really shape the policy process. And so I became very interested in federalism. I wrote a book actually on crime politics and federalism, looking at group interests and sort of how they access power at different levels of government, or how they try to, and what kinds of groups can have access. And that led me to actually a cross-national comparison. So I've sort of been like going up the ladder of levels of government. And I started understanding the American system as something pretty distinctive in how fragmented it is and sort of the many, many different places where policymaking takes place. And at the same time, I've been teaching constitutional law off and on for about 25 years. And I started noticing this kind of disjuncture between how my students talk about the Constitution, concepts like checks and balances, and what I was observing as a scholar about what that means in practice. And it was interesting that, as I sort of pushed my students to think more critically, I didn't have a lot of literature or sort of anything to point to help them understand it better. So that gap between the way the sort of the conventional wisdom that we talk about, how we talk about American politics and checks and balances, and the research on what that incredibly complex structure actually means for ordinary people and for kind of mass democracy is what led me to want to write this book, which I should say I'm in very early stages of. So, we'll see how my answers, how thorough my answers to your questions can be at this point. But that's how I sort of arrived at this topic.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that, you started off in a particular area and through examining that came to discover more about how the U.S. political system works. And then also hearing about the feedback that you get from your students. I know I've talked with a few other folks who teach at the university level, and they'll say, yeah, a lot of my writing or ideas were generated from what I was hearing from my students.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I really, that really started to sort of work its way into my thinking right around the time I spent a year living in Britain at the University of Oxford as a fellow. And I came back and had some new ideas for thinking about teaching constitutional law in ways that help students see, expand sort of stretch their minds and expand their horizons about constitutions. And I started to really run into this, this kind of conventional wisdom, and that got me very curious. And that was about 12 years ago. So I've been thinking about this for a long time.
I wanted to get into three particular terms that, in one of your articles, you call constitutional myths. And those terms are checks and balances, states' rights, and tyranny of the majority. So terms that we hear very often. They're all terms that are constantly deployed. And so I was curious why you call these three terms constitutional myths and what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I should say as I mentioned, I'm a bit early in the project here, and I've used a couple of different terms to describe these concepts, and I'm not sure I've landed on the right one yet. I'm sure people who think about myths and mythology or the term folk wisdom, which we'll get into later, I think I'm sure I'll get in trouble for using these terms maybe inaccurately. But I think that what I try to capture is these terms are kind of a received wisdom, right? That we don't that go unchallenged. We just sort of accept them um, as we hear them, and we reproduce them and repeat them without really a lot of questions, or without really understanding what they mean, or whether they actually do the things that they're purported to do. So that the concept of checks and balances, for example, like what's being checked, right? Who's doing the checking? Sort of basic questions like that. Okay, so we know that really concentrated power in a nation state can be very dangerous, but how do we know that the wrong kind of power is being checked, right? What is the wrong kind of power, right? What kind of power needs checking, and what kinds of power do we want governments to exercise? Everyone wants government to do something. States' rights. Okay, so states have rights. Well, to do what? Right? Why are states important political entities in the 21st century? These are questions that these terminologies and these concepts don't really have any answers for. Tyranny of the majority. Well, how do we know tyranny of the majority from just democratic self-governance? If majorities should win in a democratic system, well, how do we know what tyranny looks like? I mean, there are answers to those questions, right? People we can think and talk about the concept of tyranny and what that means, but these terms themselves don't really give us any answers. So each term has some fairly obvious questions that don't really have any answers. And this is one of the interesting things that happened in the classroom, where I would sort of challenge students a bit and say, well, what's being checked? What do you mean when you say checks and balances? And they would say things like, well, unconstitutional actions, right? It's like, what does that mean, right? What's unconstitutional? Who decides what that is? Tyranny of the majority. Well, why is it majorities we're worried about, like the public? Well, should we be worried about other groups like elites? And I found that I didn't really have, I feel like I was trapped in this checks and balances narrative. I couldn't sort of find a way out. And so that's part of also what really prompted this analysis, is to think more systematically about how do we answer these questions? What do they mean? And really, does our system that we think of as this kind of laudable checks and balances system, does it do the things we think it does? And maybe does it actually sometimes do the opposite of what we think it ought to be doing, right?
Yeah, that's interesting again to hear that process of getting a response and then probing with questions, and then perhaps getting another response that perhaps one could say puts forward another type of myth, or doesn't really get at the substance of something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I think, as we'll get to towards the end, something I'm curious about is, well, what is it about our particular moment, or why are you and other people perhaps starting to ask those questions? The stock phrases are no longer good enough, if you will. But we'll turn to that in a little bit. So I wanted to focus on checks and balances, because that's one that comes up a fair bit. You've written about the difference between constitutional folk wisdom, as you talked about, particularly regarding checks and balances, and the reality of a political system based on what you call veto exceptionalism. And checks and balances comes up constantly, and I've seen it especially after Trump's victory. People use terms like constitutional guardrails. People say things like, will our checks and balances hold? Right. And I will say very reputable constitutional scholars too, people in your field really rely on that too a lot. So curious about why everyone is concerned about, well, everyone seems concerned about checks and balances, but why might this be deceptive? What's kind of...
No, it's a great question. Let me start, maybe, if I could, by just a few sort of definitional things, right? Like, I think that the way, so what is the standard checks and balances concept? And I talk a lot about this. I ask everyone this. This is like my go-to question when somebody asks me what I'm working on. What are checks and balances? And most, if you grew up in the United States, most of us had this kind of civic education understanding of what checks and balances is. And people usually talk about the kind of triangle that we all see in the textbook in high school, right? There's the president, executive, there's the legislature, and there's the courts. But I would add to that, so we have two chambers of Congress, right? We don't just have a one legislative body. We're not unicameral. We're bicameral. I would add federalism, right, which is this division of power between central government and regional, national, and state. We could add some other things like the Electoral College, which is distinctive. Maybe the filibuster. So there's sort of a whole collection of things that we often refer to in this sort of generic and general term of checks and balances. And the general idea is that, well, we have all these different political venues, and this is good because it means that nobody can get too much power, right? No one branch of government will get too powerful. That's the standard checks and balances story. And then when you bring in things like federalism and, equal representation in the Senate by the states, these things are all sort of mechanisms for avoiding concentrations of power, right? That's the kind of standard, I think. Does that resonate? Does that sound like the standard kind of concept? Yeah.
Yeah, that does.
So let me say, the concept of checks on power is very important. As we see around the world right now, there's been a fair amount of democratic backsliding where, aspiring autocrat seizes power in some way and then starts to dismantle democratic processes, right? So checks on power are important, and it's in my book. I'm very careful to talk about American style checks and balances, right? What we tend to call checks and balances, which is a pretty narrow conceptualization of checks and balances. Actually, if you look across how people think about these concepts, civil society is a very important kind of check. Democratic processes, free press, protest, religious groups, NGOs, these are all really important parts of checking power. And I would argue, we could talk about this more maybe, democratic majorities are a check on power. They're a check on elite power, on the power of the private sector, of sort of concentrated power in other places. But we don't, that's not part of our sort of standard checks and balances conceptualization, right? So the concept of, I guess, sort of back to your question, sort of why are these terms deceptive? Well, another way to think about checks and balances is to think about vetoes, right? Checkpoints as vetoes. And if you look at the United States, we have a lot of vetoes. We have a kind of tricameral system, President, House, Senate. So 3 different bodies have to agree for change to occur, for policy reform to happen. Very different from, say, a parliamentary system where a party gets elected, they have the majority, and they just govern. So we have this complicated system. And then, of course, there's federal courts, right? So there's also the opportunity that maybe a court steps in or maybe states resist, So there's all these different places that are we call checks, but could also be seen as vetoes. And there are a lot of them, which is why I call it veto exceptionalism. Now, the conventional wisdom says, well, that's good, right? Because that keeps concentrated power from occurring. It avoids, too much power in one place. So my question is, well, does it? Is that how it functions? Does it really serve the functions that we think it does? And also, does it maybe sometimes do the opposite? Does it facilitate concentrations of power? So on the does it work question, if we just take the basic premise that I laid out as what checks and balances do, sort of on its own terms, right? I think we could certainly ask some questions, right? I mean, executive power has expanded massively over the past 80 or so years, right? Now, there's a lot of different views on that. Some people think that one of the reasons why executive power has grown is because gridlock in Congress. And so presidents get elected, they can't do anything. And so they try to do it in other ways. But if we look at where executive power has really grown, a lot of it's in foreign affairs. We could talk about Vietnam, we could talk about Iraq, Guantanamo Bay. I mean, all kinds of ways in which presidents have exercised really enormous power in pretty unaccountable ways. And Congress has either been unwilling or uninterested in checking. The courts have done very little to check executive power. In fact, very recently, they've just further aggrandized the executive. And we could think of other examples. We could talk about the Citizens United decision, really just sort of opening the floodgates of massive amounts of money, even more money into campaigns. So there's just a basic question there, right? Is this really what our structures are doing? Are they checking power? I will say, and maybe we could talk about this a little bit later, I think there is some recent work about how decentralized our electoral system is that might actually make it hard for someone for an aspiring autocrat to sort of consolidate voting. And so there, there's a double-edged sword here potentially, right, with some of these divisions. But I guess the thing that I really want to get to is, so what are these veto points doing, right? If they're not really checking, or if they're not at least on a regular basis, avoiding concentrations of power, which the executive seems to have grown, courts seem to have grown, right? And I think that question, what are these veto points doing? It gets us to a really, really crucial, critical element of the problem that I'm interested in, which is that the checks and balances narrative has no way of talking about concentrations of private power. So it assumes that government is the dangerous source of power, and that the private sector is just not part of the picture. But if we think about veto points, well, who has access to veto points, right? Who has access to members of Congress? Who can initiate federal litigation and carry it through to the Supreme Court, right? Who can put enough pressure on enough senators to sustain a filibuster to block something from happening, right? It's not ordinary people. And this circles back to my, my original kind of research interest as a graduate student. It's elites. It's elites. It's powerful economic elites. It's people with connection, with money, with resources. It's organized groups of business, corporations. It's a lot of concentrated power, it turns out, that has access to these veto points. So that's really, I think, a crucial and very an overlooked dimension of our checks and balances system that our own narrative doesn't give us any way to address. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It's as if the narrative that we're using, or the lens that we're looking through, is praising, or at the very least very uncritical of this thing that is a problem, or definitely something to be probed. And in terms of access to power and so on and so forth, I think it was in a book by Daniel Lazaire a while back that he uses the analogy of or the vision of political system with lots of alleyways and pathways and sort of dark corners and side pockets and so on and so forth. Very convoluted in a lot of ways. And with a lot of these breakpoints. And each one of those things is an area for some interest group to come in, so on and so forth.
Yeah, could I add as well? I mean, I think that what's interesting is so the checks and balances narrative doesn't have a way of understanding this kind of power, right? Which to be fair, the kind of concentrated economic power that we saw coming, sort of arising out of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century didn't exist in the late 18th century. And so government, thinking about sort of separating from monarchy and nobility was the dominant way of thinking about power, perhaps. I'm not a historian, but so there's this whole other thing that happens 100 years later that this structure is ill-equipped to deal with. And what we really don't have in this narrative, and this I think is critical, is what is a mechanism for checking private concentrations of private power? Democratic politics, small d democratic politics, right? Mass publics, because most people don't want power to be concentrated in the hands of the few, right? They don't want policies to just sort of fall on top of them with no idea how they happen, right? I mean, healthcare is just a fantastic example, because it's something Americans across the political spectrum are concerned about. And it's just one example after another of powerful elites, finding ways to minimize, erode, kill off, quash, right? Some kind of system that could provide universal access to quality healthcare that, but as it is, people sometimes lose their livelihoods with bankruptcy or their lives as a result. So I think that the way that democratic majorities can sometimes serve as a check on concentrated political power in the private sector there's no narrative for that. And I should say that I think the most recent election in many ways really illustrates this. I mean, there's a lot of things going on, right? And I don't want to simplify it, but Americans are understandably upset that nothing seems to change, right? No matter who they vote for. And very little of the things they really care about, like healthcare or housing or raising the minimum wage, right? So, which, by the way, I think something like a supermajority of Americans support, people across both political parties, for as long as we've been polling. Like majorities of Americans have wanted the minimum wage increased. Um, why can't they get it? That's a simple thing. And our own narrative about how our system works doesn't give us any way of understanding that.
We were talking with Thomas Gagan a little while, who's written for decades about the Senate. And he made an interesting point, I thought, about the election, saying, well, some of the things that people were understandably not, were unhappy about not getting in terms of labor rights, healthcare, so on and so forth. For whatever you want to say about the Democratic Party, some of those things were put up for legislative change and couldn't make it through our political system.
Right. Right.
And then the end result is people who are unhappy, nothing's changing, so on and so forth.
I think that's right. And I think that that's, again, sort of we sort of just take for granted this structure. And when we look comparatively, we then often just use the comparison to critique other countries, right? Like, well, we're the ones who have it right. But really, I think one of the things I'm trying to do in this book, I want to speak to political scientists, but also a wider audience. But in terms of the political science audience, we often tell these stories like about healthcare or minimum wage, with the backdrop being this convoluted system. But it's not the main. It's not the main. It's not in the main. It's not the main event. But I think we need to pay a little more attention to that. And it doesn't mean that other factors don't matter. I mean, change is hard, right? Change is hard always, and there are lots of people who might say they want, universal healthcare, but then when it comes to an actual policy, they oppose it. So it's complicated, right? There's a lot going on, but we can't overlook the fact that it's just incredibly hard to change what Blumenthal and Marone in their book on healthcare called the infernal complexity of the American political system.
Yeah, I think this is such an important point that you're bringing up. And just to bring in another example, I can't totally remember what the legislation was. It had something to do with healthcare. I think it was going to expand reproductive rights in some way. It passes, if I remember correctly, it passes the House, and then it doesn't pass the Senate because it can't get the 60 vote threshold. So you have this strange thing, in which something loses or dies, 53 to 38 or something, but which is strange enough. But then how it's reported, how most news outlets report on it is just,
yes,
this just sort of happened.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, this, as you can imagine, this, but drives me crazy. No, I think that's right. And we don't, and there's no sense either. I've been talking a lot with my students about equal representation in the Senate, and that brings up a whole other kind of level, a whole other discussion of kind of folk wisdom about the role of states in the American political system. But when we actually look at when I show them the numbers, right? So what small percentage of Americans are blocking majorities, and with a lot of the things, it's not partisan. That's the really interesting thing. It's not partisan in the public opinion sense. I don't mean that people don't still vote for their party, but something like raising the minimum wage is an extremely popular policy. I wanted to come back to something else you asked, though, about so the way people are using these terms in the way Democrats are using these terms after the election of Trump, right? The constitutional guardrails language. And it's interesting because on the one hand, as I said, right, guardrails are important. And, people who study Democratic backsliding see a lot of signs, and have for a long time, right, with Donald Trump and his people, that show clear interest in and actions towards, certainly after 2020, consolidating power, right? Finding ways to not have to have another election, as he himself put it, right? And those are very dangerous things, and they're really important. And so I think people are right to be concerned. And of course, many Republicans too, who've distanced themselves from Trump, have these concerns. The question is, how do we respond? And these sort of generic appeals to checks and balances or constitutional guardrails, I don't think are particularly helpful. And it's interesting, when we look at the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign, one of the things I said to my students before the election, and I never predict, and when I have, I've been wrong, so I really avoid it. But I said, it's interesting if you listen to Donald Trump speak. He's saying, I see you, our institutions are messed up. Now, he's couching that in all kinds of horrific, xenophobic, racist, misogynistic stuff. But he's acknowledging something's wrong. And the Democratic message seemed to be more of Trump's going to break things. He's broken things. But our institutions are solid. They're good. They function. And I don't think that resonates right now. People recognize something is wrong. Unfortunately, Donald Trump has, all of these disastrous answers, right? He's not interested in institutions functioning more democratically, right? But he identified something people really feel is real, and it is real. And so generic appeals to checks and balances, I think we need to be more concrete, right? What is it we're trying to avoid? We're trying to avoid autocracy. We're trying to avoid consolidation of very dangerous power. And one of the ways to do that is to perhaps recognize how elites across the political spectrum monopolize power and make it very difficult for ordinary people to enact, to vote for and get enacted basic policy different changes that they deserve. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And I think I agree with your analysis, and especially in that kind of pat responses of what's going to help us, what's going to solve particular things, miss the mark. And as you've pointed out too, they can also not only miss the mark, they can obscure or make it difficult for us to look at something that might be causing a lot of the problems to begin with.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, well stated. Yeah, they obscure. In many ways, in some ways, they double down on the problem, right? It's like, if we just look to the Constitution, the Constitution is a very short document. Actually, it doesn't. I always tell my students when I teach con law, I say you can read it over and over and over again, and it's not going to give you answers to the fundamental questions and problems in American politics. It's a structure, and it's a structure that is not serving ordinary Americans very well in the 21st century.
We could talk about that one for.
We could go on and on. Yeah.
When do you see these where do you see these constitutional folk wisdoms coming from, and why do you see them as so pervasive?
Yeah. That is a great question, and one that is actually this is my research agenda with my RAs for the next month or two in the spring semester. So I've done a little bit of digging around, but I don't have a great answer for that. As a social scientist, I take people seriously in their own time, and I think I don't have a overarching macro malicious narrative. I don't think it's by and large some fool the public kind of strategy. I think it's instrumental in many instances, but it's across the spectrum, and I think it has kind of intuitive appeal, right? So, but what I will say from what I do know and have done so far. So there's sort of a couple different versions of this. I think on the right, these are convenient terms for when social change is on the horizon, like big socioeconomic change on the horizon that's moving more progressively. These veto points become very instrumental and useful, and then validating them with these constitutional frames, I think, can be very helpful. And there's a real anti-statist kind of dimension to them, right? Government's bad. Government can't solve any problems. It's only dangerous. But the left has its own anti-statist narratives too. Policing is bad. The state's bad. Any kind of criminal surveillance. There's a whole other sort of way of thinking about the state. So both across the spectrum, there's sort of anti-statist rhetoric that feeds into these ideas. And as I said before, and I'll say many times, yeah, nation states can be dangerous. True. But what is it we want them to do and not do, and why? And the last thing I'll say about that, because I really, as I say, I'm sort of reluctant to go too far down this path since I don't have a lot. But the one of the things I do when I teach con law is show students how the idea of what government should do and who should get to be part of it was contested before the ink was dry on ratification of the Constitution, right? So these questions of who should be checked and how they should be checked and using different veto points as checkpoints is very, very old. And in the early republic, there were, it was very instrumental, right? So states would issue ringing endorsements of the new national government when they were doing things that they liked, and then just, absolute condemnation of the horrors and tyranny of the federal government when they were doing things they disliked. So this is not new in American politics. And by the way, understanding checks and balances as vetoes is also not new. Activists and, Black political actors in the 19th century, labor activists, farmers, people have understood for a long time that there's something about our structure that facilitates elite power more than usual for a long time. And I just think we haven't really had a good way of understanding it and framing it.
That's interesting. This idea of, well, none of these questions, or none of these constitutional questions about power, checks and balances, so on and so forth, none of these are settled questions. And yet perhaps a lot of these folk wisdom terms make them sound like they are final questions. And that makes me think, I believe it was one of your papers I was reading. In the introduction, it says, we hear a lot about checks and balances. Well, political scientists usually call this term, veto points or something like that. And that just has a whole different ring to it.
Right.
just introducing that other term made me think, there's a whole other, that sounds a little nefarious in some ways. And so a lot of study in that.
Yeah. And again, vetoes can be important, right? You want to veto the autocratic leader who's trying to get rid of elections, for example, right? But yeah, and I would say that it really, I've learned a lot of this from comparative political economy, which is not a field I really knew much about in graduate school. So, there is a whole emerging American political economy subfield in political science and a lot of people doing this work. I should be very clear about this. This veto idea is that's not original to me. I'm really working, building other people's ideas. Let me say too, though, that one of the things I like to say is that, in terms of these things are contested, right? Not settled. We learned about checks and balances as though Americans have always, loved and embraced this checks and balances system. But I think the more I dig around historically, the more I feel like, actually, I think Americans have been trying to overcome checks and balances for about 150 years, at least since the Civil War. And we do sometimes. But it does put a different spin on it when you think about the contestation and not just the kind of general, rah-rah.
It definitely puts a different spin on it. And I think one that's very important. Changing a narrative from one of absolute embrace and love to one of contestation, struggle, that can really frame things in a different way. Yeah. One thing that I think is interesting, and I really want to learn more about myself, is how veto exceptionalism and constitutional folk wisdom, Constitution in general, can affect people's ability to organize and sustain those organizations. Because, I'm involved in a lot of various projects, and almost any political project, the point of that project is to create some organized, sustained force. And it's really hard to do. And then the question is, interesting, is there something about our political system, our Constitution, the stories we tell ourselves about our Constitution, that makes that organizing especially difficult?
No, I'm really glad you're asking this question. And I know you had Aziz Rana on a while ago, and I was struck by something he said. People sometimes say to him, "Well, why should I care about the Constitution? I'm locally trying to organize for housing, or I'm doing these things that are that's irrelevant, right?" And his answer is, well, the Constitution structures a lot of that of the way we go about and what we're going to need to do to get things done. And I would go a step further, and maybe this is what he meant, but and say that I think this structure affects organizing too. It affects the ability of people to organize and the success of organizing. Look, organizing's hard, as you know. I'm sure much better than I, and it's hard always for anybody with any set of interests, but it's especially hard for groups with diffuse interests, right? We want housing, and we want to talk about healthcare and minimum wage, and we want to talk about voting rights and access to quality schools, and these are sort of big, diffuse kinds of policy questions and things that take a long time to enact. And you have the problem of free riders, right? People who agree, but well, they're organizing, it'll get done. I'll enjoy the benefits, but I won't really put any work into it. Well, it turns out it's a little easier to organize if you can offer people some kind of material incentive, or if there's some material consequence at stake that's very clear. And so who does that make organizing easier for? Well, the well-off, resourced groups. And I should say it's hard for them too. Like, organizing is just hard. Sustaining organization is hard. But it's easier if you can say, okay, well, what if we all put in this amount of money and hire a lobbyist, right, to block this policy that might have some nefarious effect on our business? It's easier to sustain that. So one of the things that veto exceptionalism does is, creates all these opportunities, creates spaces where the resource can organize to block. And meanwhile, you only have to find, if you're trying to block something in Congress, you only need one of the trifecta to make it not happen. If you're trying to get it done, you need all of them. So veto exceptionalism makes it easier to block things. And so there's a big status quo bias. Whereas, the public interest is about creating social policies that help the public. And that means actually proactively getting something done. And that means capturing all of the levels, which is ironic, right? Because the whole checks and balances narrative is, it's bad if one party has all levels, all the branches of government. It's like, well, okay, what have parties done when they've had all the branches of government? Well, it turns out it's how we have some of the most important social policies that we have, right? Social Security and Medicaid and voting rights. So that's one way in which I think veto exceptionalism makes organizing difficult. The other way, and this is something I'd be interested in seeing more exploration of, and something I saw when I was doing all the work I've done on the politics of crime, and that is the way this political structure kind of balkanizes natural allies from each other. So I live in Philadelphia. I did a lot of research in the early 2000s on crime politics in Philadelphia. And, right across the river is Camden, with a lot of the same crime problems, with the same sources. And yet there was no real reason for those groups to ally with each other, the groups working on crime prevention, because one's targeting New Jersey, one's targeting Camden City Council, Philadelphia City Council, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. There's a way in which this really decentralized structure, federalism, and all the layers, right, local, state, national, I think maybe also makes it hard for organizing, because who are your natural allies? Well, there are going to be other groups in your city or other groups in your state. And that's why I think the really organized federated groups have been most successful. Obviously, the NAACP is a good example. Labor is a great example. But also the NRA, which has this they've got local chapters and state chapters and the national chapter, and they can really coordinate among these groups. It's a way of connecting groups in different places. So I think there are multiple ways in which this incredibly fractured system imposes obstacles for ordinary folks to organize in ways that are less are mitigated somewhat by wealth, by resources, right? those are great questions, and I raised those questions, and I'd love to see more research on those topics. Oh, could I add one more thing? I'm sorry, but there's a term that interest group scholars use called venue shopping. Have you heard this term? It's like, well, you want to go to the place, go to the venue where you're most likely to succeed, right? So if you want to get rid of gun control laws, you go to states where you're going to find sympathy, right, in the lawmakers. If you want to enshrine abortion rights in a state constitution, you're going to start in states where you're going to it's going to be successful. So venue shopping is sort of going to the place where you think you're going to be most likely to be successful. But we talk about that as though that's just a thing that everyone can do. Like, well, venue, it's great. There's so many places. Just venue shop. Who venue shops? Who does that, right? Certainly not the people the vast majority of ordinary Americans who are struggling to just have access to their city council, to influence, those levels, let alone many levels at once.
It's interesting. This is making me think of a quote, and I think it ties into our next question about punishment, racism, incarceration. For the life of me, I'm not going to remember who said it, but this idea of the law. The law is great because it prohibits the rich and the poor alike from sleeping under bridges. I learned that in one of my sociology classes. And the point, of course, is, well, who would need to sleep under a bridge? And so the idea of creating some kind of neutral system does in fact not take into account power, interest groups, so on and so forth, who has the ability to do certain things.
No, exactly right. I think there's a whole kind of the class element is just obscured, right, by all this language, right? That we're not all equally, we don't all have equal access to these opportunities. Yeah.
I wanted to turn to the work you've done around punishment, racism, incarceration. I think that's very interesting. There was those topics that brought me into just political life in general when I was in college, and they're topics that come up very often in the American left. I'm here in California, and a group of folks that I organize with talk about the California prison system and so on and so forth. So bringing these topics into this conversation, I think, is very important. So I was curious how distinctive, how the American system of government and its various idiosyncrasies, particularly our style of federalism, how that can act as a barrier to really addressing racial inequalities in crime and punishment.
Yeah, this is my my wheelhouse, really where I started and what I spent most of my. It's interesting. I was never all that interested in criminal justice per se. I was interested in these other questions about accountability in government and ordinary folks. But in the 1990s, when I was starting my dissertation, this was the crime wave. There was a lot going on, policing and Rodney King and it's drug, crack, and just all these things. And so it was a really great way to get into the questions, and I just stuck with it. It's really important. So I've been a bit of a critic of some of the left scholarship, some of the scholarship that's more that's really focused on criminal justice and racism in a kind of narrow way. I think partly because it's, in my view, it doesn't take enough account of the levels of violence we have in the United States, which are very high relative to other democracies. So you'll see people talk about, why can't we be more like Norway? Right? It's like, well, Norway has no murders, right? Some, but if you watch the Scandinavian noir, right, all of the TV shows, you'll think there's murder everywhere. But so and a lot of times some of this research, I think, is, in my view, is a little too narrowly focused on policing or prosecutors in prisons, without thinking about the ways in which violence and the larger structures of American politics are implicated. To me, the incredible, devastating effects of mass incarceration and just the horrific racial disparities and um, uh, devastating effects on Black Americans in particular is the end of a much bigger set of policies and processes and causal mechanisms, causal factors. And so I think sometimes we get kind of caught up in thinking about prisons and policing in these very narrow ways, and then we get really upset and angry when they're so terrible, which they are in many ways, without sort of recognizing the priors. And so policing, you know, there's only so much police can do, right, to address violence, and yet they become the main strategy we use. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of this incredibly complicated political structure that makes it hard to address crime prevention in more systematic ways. And so at the local level, we expect local governments to solve all these problems, but we're awash in firearms, right, as a nation, which is not something local governments can do anything about. And increasingly, we can't do much about it at the state level, given recent Supreme Court decisions. But if we think about the deeper origins of violence, the despair and the lack of opportunity and the sort of intergenerational concentrated disadvantage, these are also very difficult things for cities to confront. Nobody's going to raise taxes on homeowners if they can help it in a city government, but the money's got to come from somewhere. And so we kind of have these expectations of local governments that to solve problems that are really national in scope, right? Housing, firearms, jobs, schools. And so I think without thinking about the exceptional nature of high rates of violence in the United States, we attribute to the justice system, sort of all the pathologies of American politics. And I don't mean to say there aren't pathologies in the justice system. There are. But there's also, we also put a lot on policing, for example, right? Police often go to the places where they're called to go, and they're called to go often in places where people are really suffering. And they have a tool, which is arrest. So I think that for me, I think part of how I got into these larger questions is by being not really by seeing violence myself. It was really more for the people in the 90s that I talked to, the constituents, right, the residents. They wanted to talk about violent crime, and they understood it as connected to these larger problems: housing, schools, intergenerational disadvantage. And those are issues and questions that aren't easily remediable at the local level. And I think that conversation needs to be much, much bigger and broader.
I can see how that could then unfold into or just connect with a lot of the research you're doing now, in the sense of, well, if we have these problems that need big federal solutions, many of them, but then we have some of these narratives that say, well, big federal solutions and the power to do these big things is bad. We need to return everything to the state and the local level, lest someone has the power to do something. Really.
Yeah, it's a bit of a trap, right? Yeah, and I should say I have become I've become very interested in what cities can do. But here's again where I think understanding this larger picture helps us think about practical solutions now. And so I do think there are, for example, incredibly important police reforms that can make a difference. Policing is obviously not the reason why safe neighborhoods are safe, but it may be good policing may be a really important component of lowering violence in unsafe areas in order for other things to flourish. But I think it's hard to see that if you're only thinking about the justice system. You see the horrors of policing without seeing, what could we do to facilitate more effective policing that might help some of these other things we want to do occur. But it's just a piece of the problem. But it helps us see that, I think, if we can take this wider view.
Well, to bring us to a close, I wanted to ask the question that I sort of hinted at in the beginning, which is, how are people's ideas around the Constitution changing in your eyes, both perhaps within the public sphere, also within the sphere of academia? Are people more inclined to ask the type of questions you're asking, or be more receptive to the points you're making? Um, and then I am curious, perhaps, about that distinction within, within and outside of academia, how you view those
Yeah.
two worlds, and how you think they're grappling with the Constitution.
So I think within, I will say I've had very positive reception to my book project in my discipline. Um, there's a lot of intrigue, right? Oh, I never thought of it that way. And that's been exciting. So I think there's a lot of interest in unpacking these terms that we all sort of, teach in American politics or common law, or learn and maybe acknowledge the limitations, but don't really explore further. So that's exciting. And I think, as I mentioned, there's also a whole new subfield within political science called American political economy, which I have drawn on the work of those folks extensively. As I say, I'm really building on the work of others here. And I think my innovation is to bring in this checks and balances concept, right? Is to say, well, this is what we say it does, but let's think about it more empirically. So that's exciting. And I think there's real interest in understanding better how the structures of American government, multiple, overlapping, layered, can be pretty undemocratic and facilitate some pretty undemocratic outcomes, and kind of allow elites to monopolize power in ways that we understand in American politics research, but not particularly well institutionally, right? um, so that's exciting, and I think there's a real opportunity here, I hope, with this book to really drive some of that conversation forward. I think you're right that in the wider sort of public, people who think and talk about politics a lot, there's also a real interest in better understanding where are the sources of the problem, and that's also exciting. And I think that my students, I teach at Rutgers. It's New Jersey. It's, college campuses tend to be pretty liberal. Obviously, Rutgers is no exception, but we have a wide range of political perspectives represented in the classroom, which is fantastic. And I think in some ways, there's an interesting thing happening on the conservative side, where a lot of younger conservatives are kind of rejecting the old government can't do anything model, which was for most of my adult life, from the 80s onward, was pretty standard, right? The Ronald Reagan's old famous line, right? Government's not the solution, it's the problem. I think that some of the developments over the past 15 years or so, especially since the recession, have generated some greater understanding of the role that governments play in mitigating some of the damaging externalities of modern capitalism. The democratic governments can actually do something about some of those consequences. For the liberal students, I think they're also kind of casting about for better understanding. The students interested in law are remarkably attached to these ideas, left and right and center. It is a kind of interesting phenomenon, how much they hold on to a lot of these concepts, but are also intrigued by the challenge. So I don't know, that's a bit of maybe a non-answer, but I do think we're in a moment where there are opportunities for new frames for understanding, the structure of American politics and how it inhibits ordinary Americans from being able to hold power accountable and be able to achieve the things that are important for their lives. I will say it's a little frustrating, as I say, having grown up, in college in the Reagan era, and sort of having experienced from so much of my adult life this kind of wing of the Republican Party that's just been so anti-federal government. It's a little frustrating now that the consequences of globalization and the knowledge economy, whatever you want to call it, have all had a greater effect on a lot of white Americans' lives. We're seeing in a lot of conservative areas, oh, wait a minute, government can can have a purpose, right? It's a little frustrating as somebody who's thought about these things from the perspective of racial minorities and, sort of low income urban people. Okay, yeah, that's what we've been saying. Government can have a function. Government has a purpose. Democratic governance can actually improve people's lives. We know this. But, it is what it is. We're here now. And so if more people are receptive to that, that's great.
No, that response is very helpful. And it's this question of what people are thinking, what they're saying about the Constitution, how they're seeing the Constitution, and how that might be changing. That's very much what I'm interested in. And what I've learned so much from is hearing from people who have been thinking about these things or writing about these things for a long time, because I haven't. It's only recently that they've come to my radar. So then to hear from people who have been thinking about them for a while, and then especially teachers who are interacting with students who are grappling with those ideas themselves, to hear what's going on there. I think it's all very interesting.
Well, these are dangerous times, but they're also there's a window, there's an opening, there's an opportunity to rethink, right? I always, one of the things I do with my students, I ask them to guess what percentage of Americans they think support certain policies, like let's just take increase in the minimum wage, or universal background checks for gun ownership. And I ask them to say what percentage of people who identify as Democrats do they think, what percentage of people who tend to vote Republican. And they're just always way off because they're so steeped in this polarization idea, right? Which is true, right? There's truth to that. But there's also a lot of things that Americans agree on, pretty basic things. And I think if we can focus on those things, it's a start. I'm not sure how much of those things will really significantly reduce material racial inequality, but I think that some of them very well could, like the minimum wage, for example. So
it makes me think, I think it was Thomas Gagan who called the Senate something like a fun house of mirrors. It sort of distorts how we think of what Americans want and so on and so forth. And so that's a really interesting point. And to hear what people think most Americans want, seeing it through the lens of, just as you said, gridlock, nothing can happen, division, so on and so forth. And yet below, as you said, there's actually a base of support for a lot of things.
Right. And I think it distorts our causal understanding, right? As social scientists, I think it distorts a little bit the causes of this dysfunction, because we tend to attribute it to these, we just say, oh, we're polarized, or, oh, we have the extremists. Well, why do the extremists have so much power, right? Why are the extremists in charge? How does this happen? And that's a question, I think, well, I mean, Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levinsky's book, Tyranny of the Minority, I think gets at some of these things too. But I think it's really, it's important that we call out and call attention to these things. It's funny you mentioned that about the Funhouse mirror, because I wanted to I was thinking about calling my book Funhouse Democracy, but nobody thinks that's a good title. So, because the checks and balances narrative is a bit like a funhouse mirror. Yeah.
Well, I don't know the world of the publishers and the titles, but excellent. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for coming on and really just starting the conversation around some of these topics. I'll definitely link the articles you've written in the show notes so folks can check those out.
Thank you.
And very excited for your book. We'll absolutely want to have you on again when your book is done.
I did wish it was a little closer to when it will come out, but which won't be probably till, if I'm lucky, next year. But I'm motivated, so I will keep you posted. And I really enjoyed this very, very much. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care.